Okay, good morning everyone, and we'll get started. First things first, very important, sign the register, most important. And what we're going to do today, quick recap, anchor us in, because I'm going to move off the behaviour pillar, second pillar, and we're moving to the third and final pillar of knowledge. Okay, so just to anchor us in, I'm going to go back through to our opening slide, just to remind you where we've been, where we're going in this last bit, and how it all links together, okay? Because this is the change and change methodology section, and in effect it's an integrator, it's a pulling together, it's a using of concepts that we have learned earlier, and it is, if you like, more at the practical end of what you do with this body of information. So if you remember, we started with this examination of external forces, and we bundled these forces together in what is referred to sometimes as new public management, and we had the discussion about does it matter in the public service and the whole of the issue of porosity in the organisational wall. And we've built up our argument that the public sector is special and different, but it is increasingly like the private sector in that it is open to these sorts of forces as governments around the Western world particularly seek to create more efficiency and better value for money for the taxpayer. So we've got forces, government forces, fiscal environment, labour markets, the regulatory environment, technology shifts, major infrastructure purchases by the state for taxpayers. This bundle has an effect on the organisation. We've also got an understanding that people, their expectations and behaviours and attitudes to work, life and times actually have changed from the generation that was post-war to that was in the 60s and 70s to the modern age. Actually these change. So we've had to start to think about codifying analytically how we can make an understanding of this and what we do to create some sort of fit with the organisation's requirements. We're live on camera, by the way. DiMaggio and Powell, I've made mention of the normative isomorphic forces, and I'm coming back for this one today, but we've started to examine professions, professional groups, the culture of professions, and critically the control of individuals inside organisations out with the management system, which is to do with professions. So we're going to have to look at this issue that DiMaggio and Powell identified as the isomorphic force. There are others, if you've read the monograph, referred to as the mimetic and coercive forces, which we'll make mention of, but the one that I'm particularly concerned with is the isomorphic force. And then we had a look at Mars and Snow and used their ideas to basically start to drive some sort of strategic shift. I've curated the body of knowledge on organisational behaviour using the Aston Studies framework. Aston Studies is basically the description of a longitudinal piece of work, a series of research programmes done at Aston University here in England, in the Midlands, led by some of the great thinkers in organisational behaviour and psychology. And they started to look at a relationship, hypothesize a relationship between an organisation's design, the individual's behaviour and the control systems, and started to hypothesize about the need for some synchronised effort in that if you change design, it affects behaviour and commitment, and actually it may be that the control system doesn't fit. So I've curated the body of knowledge using Aston, and we've looked at design. So we've looked at Weber as our fundamental underpinner for the design of organisations by locating authority, and we're particularly concerned with legal rational authority, but traditional and charismatic authority are also important. Burns and Stalker, we use them to look at different organisational forms, from the mechanistic, which is underpinned and basically a modern description of Weber's bureaucratic form. And something that they noticed, particularly in the 60s, because the introduction of the electronics industry, is these much more flexible organisations, flatter structures in terms of their power and ways of working, called organic structures. So we had the big mechanistic form and the flatter, more task-orientated expert power system. And I called upon Sayat March's theory of the firm cybernetics and all issues about the movement of intel, intelligence and information from the external world to the internal world, and critically that there has to be some sort of watchtower inside the organisation that has authority to pull together the information and create a plan for survival. And we started to locate this idea, some sort of cybernetic force, as let's call it strategic planning or strategic HR. And underneath that we started to look at the early great work of Murray, Maslow and McGregor, and started to look at needs, which then we updated using particularly Shine and the career anchors, and understanding, looking at the construct of justice, the theory of justice, and Professor Russo's work in identifying, calling upon justice theories, some notion of a contract, unwritten, unsaid, but nevertheless established at a psychological level, about the organisation does this for me, I do this for the organisation, there is some sort of mutual benefit. And we discussed that increasingly that is breaking down, as organisations just cannot promise individuals a job for life. They keep reorganising, they have to change, be much more flexible. So therefore, what is the new deal for workers? And is it that, come and join us, we can't promise you a job for life, but that we can promise you is by the time you leave us, you'll be more marketable. In other words, your experiences and possibly some investment in training will count. So, the psychological contract, and we touched in on Tajfel and Sharif's seminal work to look at groups, group level behaviours, groupthink, Janus. Now, have you all had a chance to read the monographs and because obviously we've talked about it, but a lot of the detail is particularly well summarised in Professor Furnham's book, that's the set text, and particularly the 2 chapters that I've listed as you're reading. They are extremely important in terms of understanding, because we didn't have much time to look at group psychodynamics, but this whole issue of very subtle control in organisation is through group cultures. That is ultimately the best kind of the best kind of control system through cultures. And the problem we looked at with a couple of working examples is, what if that culture is not correct? It is poisonous indeed. We have to change that, and therefore there are some difficult decisions for organisations about how they design their control system. And then I touched in on, related earlier to design, some issues of dysfunctionality in organisations, particularly around Tannenbaum and the hierarchical gradient, and Crozier with the game playing, power plays in the cigarette factory. The monograph is in the reading list, and Abbott's system of professions. And we can see from Abbott's system of professions, do you remember the slide I used with the development of a profession, the 5 stages? Yes, the substantiation in law of a group as a control system. This for our examination, because we're particularly concerned with groups who are described as professions, so professional groups, that actually this control system that Abbott described and its tensions, which were intra-professional, so the dynamic forces within professions as they grow, change, and basically try and stay alive, stay powerful, encapsulate more bodies of knowledge, brings them into contest with other professions. So Abbott identified an intra-developmental force and an inter-contested development force between the professions. And this is very important, because although I've put it in here because it's actually really part of behaviour and sort of groups and individuals, actually it is an extremely important long-range part of management control systems. And for control systems, we have used Mintzberg and the structure in fives to start to identify component parts of the organisation, and actually how we start to design performance that creates good connectivity from the strategic apex to the operating core via the middle management, the role and sometimes the misuse of power of the technostructure, and the role of the admin infrastructure to create, that we can design but create efficient control systems. But this is, if you like, two sides of a coin. There's the technical control system and there's the behavioural cultural control system. So management controls is quite subtle in that sense. And we've started to touch in, and more of this now, going back to the cybernetic force, and the issue of information is that we need a lot of information about how the organisation's doing. So we have to design something around performance metrics, methodology and know-how. So we've got temperature thermometers that we can dip into the organisation on a regular basis to just check how it's doing. Is it actually going to help us survive? Okay, so we have looked at the curation of the body of knowledge for the external forces and the internal forces, and we now bring them together in synthesis. And this is our consideration for today, which is the change agency. So for this, we're going to have to start to think about all sorts of stakeholders. I believe the current government don't like the word stakeholders, and I think we're using the word partners, but actually I quite like stakeholders because it gives some notion of differential in power as to opposed to partners, because partners sounds a bit equal and a bit sort of friendly, and that certainly isn't the case necessarily when we're looking at change methodologies. Okay, so forgive me, I'm going to use the word stakeholders, and to help us I'm going to use Ottaway's classification, which I find very helpful. It's quite old now, developed in the 80s, but still relevant, I think. So who is making the decision to change? So we've got policy makers, policy takers, and moderators. They all have roles in public service change. And then we've got the change agents, and I want to distinguish here agency and agents. Why do I want to distinguish? What's the difference?
One is institutional and one is an
Very good. I've got to change agency. The word agency is very helpful in this respect because it's kind of got some sort of umbrella characteristic in which I can encapsulate a number of ideas that describe players who are all important. But there's loads of them. So this agency of change that mobilises an idea and creates change in the public sector, actually I can classify them in terms of their role for making the policy, but people who make policies aren't necessarily the people who implement them, and that is very much the case in the public sector. So becoming more specific about the change agents, who is actually going to do the job. So if the government changes the law on how we do children's services, for instance, and the implementation of some sort of new force around child protection regulations, how is that mobilised? Because ministers are ministers, civil servants are civil servants. They actually don't deliver anything on the ground. So we've actually got to understand there are people in organisations whose job it is to take these imperatives, take these instructions and actually implement them. So for our purposes, I've identified some sort of change agent that is within an organisation that I might start to call strategic steering group members. So these are obviously going to be sort of powerful people in the organisational sense, project managers, program managers, someone's got to hold the lot together. HR specialists, you're going to muck up people's jobs, you're going to basically make them different or make them redundant. People have legal rights, so we do need HR specialists, particularly about working with staff side, the trade unions, and how all that happens. Plus we've got to develop organisations, organisational development specialists. And do you remember last week I touched in on all the issues associated with what development strategists can do when you've got organisations that have particularly difficult, intractable cultural problems. And we looked at the prison service, for instance. And then, of course, you need some technical support underneath that. So I'm distinguishing change agents and the change agency. Actually, this is quite important because we've had in the past, in the exam, these are very specific terms and people have confused them. So they've written brilliant essays, but it's the wrong essay, okay? Because if I ask you about the change agency, I'm asking about this. So if you write about that, that's not necessarily what we're after. Do you see?
Which one would be considered the catalyst?
Well, let's unpack that because it's a good question, but it's not a straightforward one to answer. Because actually, you could equally argue for any of these. Any of them could be. They're all potent in their own right, in that sense. So we are particularly concerned in the public sector about really the collectivisation of power and how change is initiated, driven, embedded, underpinned, and it is a collective effort. And today we're also going to look at the change strategy. What do we actually do? So I've got the change agency, change agents, okay, and then change techniques. They're three distinct pieces of knowledge that we're going to unpack. And for this, I'm curating the body of knowledge using Tishi's work. Okay, Noel Tishi. So that is a technical, a cultural and political dimension. Okay, 3 dimensions of change. So it's a curation device that I'm using. I mean, Tishi did do some very good work, and what's quite important with it is it was longitudinal, because a lot of work that's published is a bit sort of poor methodologically. If you run a critical eye over much change evaluation work, what you will find is it's cross-sectional. And in cross-sectional work, particularly evaluating change, when do you take the datum point? If I did a cross-sectional design, halfway through? At the end? When's the end? When I walk out the door? 10 weeks on? 10 months on? 3 years on? It actually really matters to the results that you would get because you're interested in long-term sustained change. So actually the datum point for cross-sectional design is very important. And most change programs are evaluated as one-off, straight through cross-sectional design, and they tend to be sort of either immediately at the end of the technical change program or sort of like halfway through, and they send around little questionnaires saying, are you happy? Do you like the change? And it is completely inadequate. So therefore a lot of research in this area, and I'm afraid a lot of theorisation and an awful lot of books are not very good. So when you're sort of trying to find a decent textbook and actually decent case examples, you've got a real problem because methodologically they just don't stand their rigour. But the one that I'm going to refer to is the one I think that was, even though it was quite early and warts and all, is probably one of the best shots, and that is Professor Ewan Furley's evaluation of, and it was a longitudinal design, of work that the government initiated in one of the big hospitals in the Midlands. Okay, and I'm going to just describe a little bit about that, but methodologically it's probably one of the best we've got. But we need to curate technical, cultural and political, okay? And that's what we're going to do today and the week after next. And then we've got to look at change in terms of POLIT, and that's the multi-agency bit and the evaluation, but that's for next time. So we don't have to worry about that at the moment, but that sits underneath this. It's a subset of. Okay, so as we're coming towards the end of our time now, we have considered this in pillar 1, this in part pillar 2, we're in pillar 3 now, and this is our consideration, okay? Agency, agents, and strategies, techniques, okay? So that is, and for that I'm going to call on Tishi, but just to finish off and then close off the last pillar of the body of knowledge, I just want to check, and I've got to make mention of high impact human resource management programs. Now, shall I just do that, shall I? Just running through on groups. Have you all got access to Fernham? Have you all, if you haven't read it yet, you've got to read it before the end of term. But you need to be familiar with the 2 chapters that I've listed for you from Fernham. And let me just go through very quickly, just to check everyone's okay with groups before I leave it, sadly, forever. Security, goal achievement, why do we bother? Big ones, social needs, self-esteem, mutual interest, different sorts of groups. Command groups, task groups, link through to our examination, Burns and Stalker, mechanistic, organic form, interest group, friendship groups, they're all fine, keep them out of work though. And then this whole issue of the build-up of groups and the importance of context, permissions, leadership, and we went through the location of conflict and dysfunctionality in groups. So forming, storming, norming, performing, adjourning, this is where conflict in groups, the problem is laid here. So we actually have to manage this well as a process, and we looked at techniques to reduce the risk of conflict, and we also looked at the sorts of risks for 2 sorts of problems. Do you remember groupthink? What was groupthink again? Yeah, I mean, crudely put, yes men. It's more potent than that. It's sort of like there's a sense of fear, but there is also a strong sense of binding with the leader and actually desperately wanting to belong and stay in this exclusive club, and therefore suppress any sort of criticism, suppress any sorts of concerns, because you would be basically rejected by the group. And this is extremely important as a risk in organisations, because fine and efficient when they're making good decisions, but once in a while, statistically, they must make a bad decision. So actually they could take the organisation over a cliff. So that's why, particularly well done in Fernham's chapter, we want to think about the role of devil's advocates and mechanisms to reduce the risks of groupthink within our organisations. And we called upon Belbin, albeit briefly, but it was Belbin's work that identified different sorts of roles, and we've all got our preferred roles and then roles that we are happy to be trained in and developed in, that we can take in organisations' group work that actually create efficiency in groups. Okay, so the risks in groups, what were they? Pardon? Social loafing, yes, I like that phrase. It's rather good, isn't it? The risks in groups that you're always trying to reduce is groupthink, the culture of the personalities, that covalent binding and all of that, yes, and conflict. Remember Janus? All right. So this whole big area of groups, social psychology, group psychodynamics, people's need to belong and compliance with groups that sometimes can tip the other way. And our interest is particularly understanding risks in group and reducing risks. Why do we want to reduce the risk? because they're inefficient, they create the drag. They actually bring the organisation down. So that's why we want to reduce the risks. Okay, so can I implore you to please, please, please read the monographs that have been laid for you in Furnham, and critically to understand them with our lens for this course, which is about reducing risk. That's why you're reading those sections. It's actually to understand what can go wrong and what we can do to proactively manage the risk before things go wrong. Okay, before I leave this totally and then switch into Tishi, I just want to make mention of, now if I could just say, there are folks over at FW who spend 2 years doing a full MSc on everything on this slide. Okay, so we are not going to cover it in anything like even the rudimentary detail, but you cannot go through life without knowing that there is a great body of research that has started to look at what makes organisations better than others. And if you look at several sorts of research programs, and I'm also particularly interested in a guy called Professor Ulrich in the States. Ulrich's work is where, and others, have started to look at successful organisations and then splitting that cohort and starting to see which organisations are like the top 10 and the bottom 10 of successful organisation, and what's the difference. And so they have been able, through a series of quite good, well-designed research programs, identify some things that make a difference. And this is called the high-impact HR practices. So we know that in some organisations that have high-impact HR practices, they do better. Okay, so now that we understand behaviour, group psychodynamics and controls, these are broadly the HRM bundles of practices that, if they're in place, and it's not a Chinese menu pick list, by the way, you have all of it or none of it. So the bundle actually in place gives you a better chance of survival. So recruitment selection to ensure the traits and behaviours, skills and knowledge are a good fit. Okay? Who are they drawing on there? Where have we seen this before in our examination? A good fit of the psych profile with the design of the job. So that's Professor Holland's work on job personalities, job profiles. It's the basis of assessment centres and that issue of fit. Okay, so you've got all these people who apply for jobs. Actually, there's nothing wrong with them. They're all very good. It's just on the day that actually what they're looking for is all these skilled people, but also this good fit with the design of the job and the individual's bundle of skills, knowledge, personality, etc. Lots of communications matter. Lots of communications and two-way information flows and staff involvement. What do you think we can draw on there analytically to help describe this? Impart Tannenbaum, reduce the size of the gradient. And Mintzberg, the connectivity. Remember, Mintzberg, strategic apex, strong connectivity, two-way information flows to the operating core. This is what Mr. Justice Sheen found was particularly one of the risk factors that was missing in the Townsend-Torrison inquiry, and came up with a marvellous phrase, which is, from top to bottom, the body corporate was run through with the disease of sloppiness, okay, in part to explain why the ferry, the P&O ferry, Townsend-Torrison, tipped up with all the people on board and drowned. Mr. Justice Sheen was the chairman of the inquiry. And we know from Ulrich's and others' work that communications makes a difference, and I would look to Mintzberg there to describe that connectivity. And who is the great limiting step, the critical role played in connectivity between strategic apex and the operating core? The middle managers. And the problem there is that they are often under-resourced, got too much to do, there are not enough of them. They're doing like 2 or 3 people's jobs, and critically that, and sometimes they are not competent, they're over-promoted, and sometimes they're actually competent, doing their best, but their power and position is eroded by overbearing technostructure power systems. Organising work in teams with flexible job designs with a reduction in repetitive tasks. So what did they do at the bun factory where I worked as a student? By the way, Pam, my flatmate, whose birthday I was at over the weekend, she was with me in the donut factory. We were reminiscing on it just this weekend. Okay, organising work into teams, reduction of repetitive tasks. What do I introduce in jobs to reduce? Rotations. So rotations, so we have to think about boredom cycles, repetitive cycles, and that was a counter, very strong counter to Taylorism and Taylor's design, which was the flows of jobs, which is correct, but his assumption that, well, you could stand there for 8 hours and just do this without being bored and dysfunctional, actually is a heroic assumption, and it took particularly the rise of the humanistic movement to start to say, actually, we can design jobs better and create more interest for the individuals. So teams become important. Lots of training and development fixed around organisational problem solving, systematic knowledge management. So training and development, which always is the first budget to be cut, by the way, actually is very important because you're refreshing the workforce constantly. You're helping them to cope, you're making them more resilient, but you're also giving them skills and knowledge that basically make them more competent, make them more efficient in an organisational sense. So lots of training and development, and lots of performance appraisal and staff development linked to rewards. So do you remember? We made mention of management by objectives, Locke's work on stretch goals and the objectives that I set for you, and I have an appraisal with you, check how you're doing, I map out your development needs for the next year, what you should try and do by way of goals over the next quarter, the next year, etc. Yes? And many organisations have quite good appraisal systems, but also many organisations have appraisal systems that have fallen into some sort of bureaucratic nightmare. So it becomes just a sort of like mass of form filling and churning of a whole load of forms that you get in the post, you sign, but you've lost the spirit of sitting down with a boss, with supervisors, working out your development needs and actually how you're going to contribute to the organisation in the future over the next year, and what the organisation needs to do to invest in you to make you competent to do that job. Okay? Anyway, this is known as the high impact HRM bundle. There is a mass of research behind it, very good. So we're getting better in terms of methodology. So we're talking about longitudinal designs and multiple regression analyses. So we're getting more confident of actually these factors that, if they're in place, would make a difference. So the high impact HR practices, if we could put them in place, would be beneficial. Now, where the research is, the debate, the theorisation of human resource management actions, do they make a difference or not, is where should we locate the HR job? Is it in personnel HR department with HR specialists, and they do this for the organisation, or should we devolve it and actually it is middle managers' roles, and they are supported by HR specialists. So the HR folk change their role. As opposed to being specialists who do everything, they become business partners. HR business partners is the phrase, where they come in and work alongside the middle managers so as not to erode middle managers' authority. What does the team think? Where should we start to be in this debate? The latter, yes. There has been, I think we're at the moment of realisation, or have become into this moment of realisation, possibly over the last 10 years or so, research-wise, that actually middle managers really matter. And everything we've done from about the early mid-80s, which was the beginning of this wave called business process re-engineering, which was the flattening down, the pancaking down of the big bureaucratic forms, making them much flatter. So actually the structure of the triangle was like this, much flatter. That actually, ever since that wave, that movement, BPR, as it's sometimes referred to, you see it in journals, business process re-engineering. Basically, what you have seen is a constant attack on middle managers, their existence, their role, their contribution, and that particularly in the public sector, some vilification of these folks that basically are doing 2 or 3 people's jobs. They're doing a very important job, but actually no recognition. And that's where the first shaft of cuts go in when you're trying to save money. Okay? And I think we're sort of coming out of that tunnel now and starting to create an understanding that HR practices matter, but actually HR specialists, so I'm a middle manager and actually I can't do any of this because that's HR. So there has been a divorcing of a central part of my role and basically some delegation to another function called HR, and HR are now confident enough to stand up based on the research to say, no, it's your role. We come in and support you because, you know, most middle managers haven't got the wherewithal to be updated in all the time of the law. So you need law specialists. They also are not always up to date in terms of all the complexities of organisational development strategies, training programs. So you have specialists in HR who come in and buttress managers, but actually the location of the role, the leverage in the system on the HR, and where you develop these HRM practice bundles is actually with middle managers. Okay, so I think we are now moving into a healthier position in our theorisation dilemmas, into starting to understand this space called middle managers and starting to say actually they are important, we focus on the role and what is it that we've got to do to support them. So Ulrich and all the researchers working in this field called the high impact HRM practices, particularly over the last 10 and last 20 years, but particularly the last 10, actually have started to create knowledge that makes organisations much more sustainable. Okay, so these are the high impact HR practices. Do you work? How many of you work in organisations that you think exhibit high impact?
HR business partners now, and I think probably my role is a bit middle management, and I have to do the HR, and that's fine, but it is difficult because it's like I'm a nurse. I've never done any sort of HR training, so it's about being able to contact people to get the right advice,
yes,
and knowing where to find the policies on the intranet and things
yes,
like that, and actually it's great once you find the information, but you can spend an awful lot of time trying to find the information that you need to start the process, whatever process you're trying to do.
Yeah, yeah.
So.
Yeah, it's good though. Is that a community organisation?
No, it's Imperial.
Oh, it's Imperial. Oh yeah, excellent, excellent. Because that is a very big bureaucratic form. So yeah, needs must. Okay. Anyone else working in an organisation they feel exhibits high impact HR? No? All getting there, like the train. Okay. Keep your eye on it. It's actually quite important. Okay. Now, I'm going to dive in now on Tishi and introduce you to Tishi and his ideas, her ideas, and start to sort of think about how we can use this to start to get a fix on organisational change and all the bits that have to be done. And I'm going to call on bits of the course that we've done in previous weeks. Now, normally I will have done leadership and leadership theories by now, but I'm saving that to the next time I see you because I need a big block of time. So I'm going to do Tishi first, and then I'm coming back for leadership. Okay, but I'm going to have to mention different models of leadership as I do this, and you'll start to go, "Ooh, what is transformational and all of this?" Just start getting used to the language, make a note of it, but we will unpack it in detail next time. Okay, so Tishi. Tishi, so original research, actually it's a little bit old now, but nevertheless was designed very well for its time, again, period of the 80s. And the main thing is it was longitudinal. And as a result, the research teams were able to go back time and time again and start to evaluate. Now this is a very busy slide, and it's going to take us the rest of this morning to go through this, all right? So I think it's just this one. Is there another one? Oh, just check. Oh yes, these two. What on earth is this jigsaw puzzle stuff going on? Anyway, have you got copies of this? It should be on Keats. You've got copies? No. You haven't got it listed on Keats? No? No worries. I'll try and get that sorted this afternoon, don't worry. We're going to use this for the rest of today and actually part of next time anyway. Now, Tishi's work was in the chemical industry, but that's by the by. The key thing is, as a result of longitudinal analysis, started to look at one of the problems in methodological terms is when you're looking at evaluating change, we just focus here first, actually most people get the technical component right. Okay, these, cultural and political, are the things that hold you below the waterline. These are the things that make a change programme fail. But actually, if you look at a cross-sectional design to evaluate change, most will just evaluate the technical components immediately after the change programme. And actually, you tick all the boxes and say, God, it was good. It was really good. It's only when you have a longitudinal design and you come in and start to evaluate the longer term cultural and political dimensions that you realise, while this was good, these were not done very well, and therefore actually the change programme has not achieved its goals. It hasn't held up in final analysis simply because the examination, the evaluation of the change was restricted here in what I'm going to call time one, all right? So immediately after the change programme. So we are just restricted here. Okay, so because Tishi had a longitudinal design, actually went back time and time and time and time over a long period of time, able to identify these much more important components and came up with a change model which is known as TCP. Okay, so when you go up to the library to get Tishi's book out, it's got a blue cover and it's got like a three-stranded rope. So there's a red rope, a white rope and a yellow rope, and they're unfurled, and that is the technical rope, the cultural rope and the political rope. And what Tishi said was, you can't do change in one without all the others. So you actually have to change all three simultaneously, and then you have to replat it. So actually it's a whole. And the weakness in most change programs is that everyone knows you have to do cultural things, but it's too difficult, and you know, it feels a bit soft. It feels a bit sort of developmental. We'll get to that, but they never do. And everyone knows that they have to manage and put a strategy out and manage the politics of change, but actually are frightened by it. So they don't do it very well, and as a consequence, the politics are not managed well, and that erodes the efficacy of any change programme. So Tichy, using longitudinal design, came up with a model of a three-stranded rope, a technical, a cultural and a political, three strands, and that work is required in each strand simultaneously. And critically, the evaluation showed that in the technical sense, most people get this right. In a cultural sense, most people know it's there, but actually don't get it in focus, don't invest in too much of it. So actually the erosion of a change programme starts here, and then the whole thing is undermined because the politics of change are not managed. Okay? So if we look at, well, what is it that we have to do in these three dimensions of change that Tichy identified? In your reading packs, I've put, I used to give out 6 chapters from his book, and then I got told off, so we're not allowed to do that anymore. And you might want to have a look at the book in the library, but there's a couple of articles, quite long, but nevertheless they are a crunch of all his stuff. So actually, you, if you read that article, that's sufficient. There'll be enough there for you. In the technical component of change, what we've got is clarity in service needs. Okay, so the model's design. What is it you're trying to do so that you understand the context and what's the plan? What is it you're trying to do? Are we trying to make us cheaper, take out 20 million? Are we trying to make us more effective? We have less death rates. So we've actually got to have clarity. Now, I know you might be looking at me thinking, yes, and your point. Let me tell you, after many, many years, the vast majority of change programmes I've been called in and worked on to evaluate, there is no clarity of what the goal is of change. So although we're saying, I think quite reasonably and quite sensibly, what's your goals? Actually, in practice, many organisations do not set goals for their change programme. So that immediately gives us a problem, because as we'll see, the complexity of change means that everyone's got a different vision in their head of what we're steering towards, and there is no synthetic view. So, in a technical sense, we've got clarity in service needs. What is it we're trying to do? What is the scope of the work and who needs to be involved? So we need to have an understanding from Ottaway's classification, which we'll look at in a moment, of, well, who do we involve and where do we put them in the scheme of things? Timescales and budgets. Okay, that's really important to bottom out. And again, sometimes change programmes reasonably might be scaled over 5 years. I'm just working on, for instance, 7-day services forum, where we've got to go up basically from 5-day working in the main to 7-day services. Yes, and the top people want that scaled in over 3 years. And when we've sat down and actually mapped the work programme, all the jobs that have to be done, it's not possible. So we've eased it over 5 years. Okay, but I can tell you there are other constituents who think, no, we're going to do that in a year. So actually there needs to be some sort of collectivised understanding and view of what is it you're going to do in a year, over 3 years, and over 5 years. Because if you say to most senior people, this change programme's 5, if not 10 years, what's the reaction? Too slow. No, we're not having that. So we have to basically understand it is possibly taking into account the cultural and political dimensions, 5-10 years, but we have to manage stakeholders who this phrase would be unacceptable. So we have to start to look at chunking up work about, well, these things are done as preparation in the first year, we then build on it, and these would be the second and third years to underpin it. But top people need deliverables early. They can't wait 5-10 years, particularly politicians. They change their job, they're out of office. So timescale and budget. clarity in legal and regulatory constraints. Many's the time when I've gone in to work on a change programme or evaluate it, and one is you can't find the goals, and then you find the people calling for the change actually don't have the legal power to call for that change. Actually, you can't get going because they have no power of attorney to do it. So we've actually got to make sure that these things are in place. Okay, so clarity. And it might be teaching grandmother to suck eggs here, but basically Tishu was very helpful because what we got for the first time is some sort of technical jobs list that's recognised that have to be done, and you might say stating the absolute obvious, as much of it is, but it is worth stating nevertheless, because we can't make the assumption that everyone understands these are the jobs that have to be done in this sequence. The gift of Tishu, the analysis based on longitudinal, is that actually the thing that starts, most people get this right, by the way, because we now have got professional project managers. Are any of you professional project managers? They're very, very common in public health, but none here today. Okay. The project manager's jobs, very common in which industry? Engineering, yeah. Because if you're going to sort of build a new bridge across the Thames, okay, that means there's a whole sequence of jobs that have to be done in the right order. It's going to go over 5, if not longer, years. And you don't want them starting to make the components of the steels and the bridges in Norway and Malaysia now, because you'll be paying for that. So actually, you've got to do all the prepping work first. So you've got to bring the dredgers up, clear out the Thames, put foundations in. So you don't want to order the steels probably for another 2 or 3 years, but you need guys, and they're called project managers, whose job is to look at all the sequencing and bring the orders forward, manage them. So if you're building a big oil plant, you know, with all those pipes and that, or a big warship, project manager's job is to get the staging quite correct and basically manage, bring that job on, no, hold that one off, we're delayed here, and manage all these complex stagings. So because this is now very well understood and very well developed in the engineering industry, and we've got quite good training and also software management systems. Some of you will have done courses on Prince methodology? No? Never heard of it? It's quite good actually. I mean, if it's not too complex, you could always just do it on the back of a fag packet. But Prince methodology and the software is quite sophisticated, and it helps you just manage when you've got huge numbers of tasks that have to be done, about how they're staged in. And from industry, we've got project managers who basically have got a very good understanding of identifying the jobs that have to be done technically and then mapping them through, okay, and then supported by software. So that's quite good. What we know is the cultural dimension is important and actually has quite big explanatory force for the failure in the long term of cultural change. So what's the cultural change? Well, we've started to examine this in our group psychodynamics, yes? So clarity in the constituents involved. Who are we talking about in terms of the cultural changes? And there's many different sets of stakeholders. Clarity in the role of pilot projects, sometimes called samplers, tasters, etc. Now, why would I be interested in pilot projects as a device to help cultural change? Yes, it's basically not so offensive. If you go to a whole load of groups, very well established professions, and just say, stop what you're doing, we're going to do this, and believe me, I know it's good for you, so you're going to do this. Actually, it doesn't work. And you need to be able to get into the core identity and work with key important opinion formers within groups that basically say, yes, this is a good idea, and they help develop the idea that we all own. So ownership becomes extremely important, a psychological ownership, okay? So there is ownership, and one of the ways to create ownership is that you craft it. So pilot schemes, having a go, actually taking the idea and forming it, trying to implement it, seeing how it goes. Piloting is extremely important because if it doesn't work, you've still got flexibility to change things. You can actually, in psychological terms, put an egg in it. Okay? Now, do you remember Mary Baker's cake mix? Do you remember that? When I talked about that, that is such an important thing to remember. Remember the cake mix? The whole product bombed. Even though all the research building up to the launch of that product in the 60s showed it would be extremely successful. But it bombed, and the research showed that women felt they cheated their families by using basically a kit. I mean, it was the 60s, you know. We wouldn't care now. We'd go to the shops and buy, or in fact, you'd tell your family, go and buy your own cake. You know, got your own money, sort yourself out. But basically, having everything for the cake mix, take out the dried egg, tip it in a bowl, crack a fresh raw egg in it, a bit of water, got cake mix. Put an egg in it, pilot it. Very, very important as a hook, particularly in skeptical professions, in groups that are extremely covalently, extremely well bonded as their core identity, okay? Clarity in the role of experiential learning, and what we know, particularly in the cultural dimension, learning on the job, learning new ways of working and with peers actually is very good. So learning experiences. So if we develop our cultural change program as a community of practitioners where they see it as learning new practices, improving their practices, okay, then actually I can start to get into that core and start to redefine it and put in new practices. So what sorts of things can I do in communities of practitioners in the health service to improve the outcomes in maternity services, surgical services, cancer services? What can I do? It's a practical example. I want to create a learning environment. I'm going for cultural change. Heard of clinical networks? Yes? I can create a network, a clinical network of practitioners who all work in cancer care or who work in surgical care or maternity care. Okay, and how can I get them to reflect on their practices? It's no good me going in there saying, trust me, I've read the big books, your practice isn't very good, I want you to change it like this. People get defensive. So how can I get them to come up with a learning strategy in a learning network? Develop their own guidelines. I can get them to audit their practices. I want them to get some feedback, and I want them as a group to sit down and look at that feedback and actually look at that feedback and think, well, how can we change things that reduce risks, for instance? So maybe 5 years ago, the health service here was running through with lots of risks of infection, MRSA, C. difficile. That is much reduced now because there was a systematic approach, particularly in nursing, with creating feedback to groups of nurses constantly. This is your infection rate last week, last quarter. Actually, can we do better? What sorts of things can we do? What are the microbiologists telling us about our practice? Where there's risks. So all sorts of things get introduced on the back of reflective practice. Okay, so we know that these terms, learning networks, networks of audit, use of data, feedback, designing new improved practices from within the group of practitioners actually is quite useful and works. And we can call these community of practitioners. Okay, so I'm not restricting it to any particular kind, but this is now set up as quite a long-term learning network underpinning the technical changes that have to go on. Okay, staff involvement. Do you remember from our high impact HR bundles of practices? A thing that absolutely sings out constantly is staff involvement, good communications. People who feel involved stay involved, and actually it is all embracing in terms of reactions to change, being part of change, not being threatened by change, is to involve staff. So what kind of gradient would such an organisation that has full of learning networks, communities of practitioners, reflective practices, heavy on staff involvement, what sort of gradient in Tannenbaum's terms would that organisation have? Low gradient, exactly that. So in other words, the power distance between those on the lower levels of organisations with the middle managers and the seniors, the gradient is quite shallow. Okay, so it's an ease of communications. So to identify, if I was, oh no, Genghis Khan Oakley, just been commissioned by your organisation to come in and evaluate change, I like my metrics, okay? So if I want to check, where are you in terms of cultural development? Because if I go to the technical, if I'm evaluating change, I go to the technical jobs list, I will basically see tick, 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 because actually we know what the jobs lists are. I could virtually map them out for you now. Generic technical change program for a health service organisation. And you know the sequencing of them, and you just go through and tick them. What I want to know is I need a thermometer, a dipstick to put in the organisation to say, did it actually make a difference here? So I might use Tannenbaum's hierarchical gradient questionnaire, short, pithy, just to see what your gradient is. And I might do that in several organisations, and I might get myself a set of reference gradients so I can work out broadly, are you with low gradient organisations or are you part of high gradient organisations? And an organisational development goal is I'm going to reduce the size of that gradient, let's say by 30% over the next 2 or 3 years. Okay? So in other words, I want to put quite a lot of money into a cultural development programme, because how much do you think if I wanted to sort of develop, you know, those midwives and all the problems with the that were identified in the CMEC report that's in the reading list? Yes? How much would I want to invest broadly? If I put £250,000 into most maternity units for the development of that unit so that they would not report into the CMEC next time round, what would I buy with £250,000? What do you go to the shops for to get a cultural change programme? What does the supermarket contain? Training programmes. Pardon? Leadership programmes, yes, quite developmental. Communications strategies, put in more communications, buy myself an intranet, buy briefing sessions, buy myself some facilitators. I could even, if I was really good as an organisation, identify 6 or so staff who could be trained as facilitators, learning facilitators, and they're a resource of the organisation. So I buy one specialist who trains 6 staff who are identified as a part-time role. So I have to buy out part-time role. They're a nurse. I have to buy the other half of that nurse because they've still got to do work. Yes? So can you see how you would buy a cultural development programme? All these components in what's called the organisational development supermarket. What do you actually buy for £250,000 to get you one of these? Okay, and all sorts of developmental programs. Now, most development programs require normally at least a year, but probably 2 or 3. Okay, so you need a rolling cycle of development. So you need to develop a learning agenda, and the learning agenda has to knit and fit with the change objectives. So I need change objectives from here that inform my learning objectives, which I build up with the community of practitioners. I identify local learning systems and facilitators, and I create some sort of learning system. And a mechanism that describes this, that was developed I think probably about 25, 30 years ago, but it's actually now really done quite well. And you'll hear them referred to as action learning sets sometimes. And the action bit is because they have to do a group project. So 2 or 3 people, maybe 5, will work on a project that's part of an improvement programme. So for instance, when I work in North Wales, they've got a huge development programme going right across North Wales. It's just one complete healthcare network system. Very, very good chief exec, very innovative. And they've got basically half a dozen strategic change programs they want to implement as an organisation to create more efficient but better service. And they have grouped people like doctors, nurses, all sorts together in working groups, and their job, they're underpinned, they're trained, they're supported, but their job by the end of the programme is to come up in their learning set with a diagnosis of a problem, a service problem, recommendations for change, and then actually map through the change programme. And these can be quite modest, but if you do loads of them, these small pieces all add up to something. Okay, so you'll hear this expression, the action learning set, which is, if you will, a collective of these learning projects using communities of practitioners. So this is about a long-term investment. Okay, so most organisations that are busy, heroic, sometimes say, well, actually, we're not really interested, and we'll have some training, yes, 2 or 3 workshops. But actually it's much more than that. It's a very deep underpinning, because I'm trying to define what the standards are in the group psychodynamic, in the inner core, and you just don't do that overnight. Okay? And what Tishy also said was essential, but quite often not done well, or if at all, is the political dimension of change. So this is where we need to start to think about all the political stakeholders, which we'll examine after the break. So I've got political stakeholders. They all have different sorts of leverage on the change programme. Some can block, others can shout, but they don't block. So we need to have some sort of way of understanding this political dimension of change. And everyone's got their price. So basically, political strategy is bundling up groups of stakeholders and then doing a deal. What will it take? And it's not always money, but what will it take? And actually cutting deals. And where you will not cut a deal, actually how you contain that political bloc and keep them out from interfering with a change programme. So for this, there has been a little bit of work, particularly described rather elegantly by someone called Kurt Lewin, and you'll hear it referred to as Lewin's force field analysis. I'll do a fag packet version of it after the break, but basically it's a way of understanding your stakeholders and their power systems. So you build up a topographical map. Now, do you know what a topographical map is? Right, a map is a piece of paper, and you know where there's a forest because it's green. You know which bits are sea because they're blue, yes? But the problem is the land isn't flat, the sea's not flat. There's depths and there's heights. So how do we represent those different levels on a flat bit of paper? We have lines, like little, for the land, little brown lines, And the closer they are together, what does that signal? Steeper, yes, some sort of escarpment, some sort of steepness. And if they're wide apart, some sort of low gradation, yes? So that the gradients in the land and in the depths of the sea are shown crudely. In addition to blue, brown and green, is shades of blue, brown and green and lines, and that then gives you a feeling of 3 dimensions on a flat bit of paper, and that is called a topographical map. I can do exactly the same in my force field analysis with my political dimension, and I can map out all the power players, identify them and map them out. I can look at how they're connected, so the relationships of the power systems, and then I can build out the topography of the power system, because some will be very powerful and some will be not very powerful. Okay, so I've got a 3D picture of my power system, and that allows me to then map through a political strategy. So I'm particularly interested in key opinion formers, and I'm particularly interested in the group where they're entrenched and they're never going to change. So in a standard distribution, basically those that are positive, the 3% who are positive, these key opinion leaders are incredibly important. They must be on board, and because they will drive and lead a change programme, particularly from the political dimension. Similarly, and they'll bring the 67%, the 1 standard deviation normal distribution folks through. There's equally going to be 3% in the standard deviation who are like a ball and chain, you know, just never going to come with you. My own personal view is you should sack them, but I understand that most people do things less heroically than that. So we've got to basically have a management programme for the people who drag a change programme back. Okay, so there's 2 driving forces going in the opposite direction that we can define statistically. So Tishi's work is important to us because it's based on longitudinal, and we've got a technical, cultural and political dimension. So after the break, I'm going to dig in a bit more and start to understand 1, DiMaggio and Powell's isomorphic force and what else I have to do to make the cultural change programme work, and Kurt Lewin and Ottaway's classification of the political topography and how I map together a political programme. So we need to dig in behind this curation of ideas set out for us by Tishi's work. Just for completeness, broadly, in a big complex change programme, there'll be 5 work programmes. There's normally a scoping work. Always do a pilot study. Believe me, never, ever jump in, all guns blazing, scaled. You'll have your feet cut off. And then we've got to map the technical, cultural and political programme, and then we have to evaluate the programme. When should we evaluate the programme, by the way? When does the evaluation start? Most evaluations, everyone finishes it and then says, oh, shall we get evaluation in? No good. You start evaluation on day 1. In fact, I would start evaluation on T-1, because you're starting to understand then what is it that you're trying to achieve over what timescale, because that then affects your evaluation. And critically, in change methodology, evaluation is often part of the change process, because you're feeding back the evaluation into the mix over 1, 2, 3 years. So actually, it becomes part of the change process. Okay? So evaluation is not quite what it seems. We're evaluating, but it's not like an evaluation and then you close off. We're using it as an instrument of change, an instrument of feedback, an instrument of checking pace. Okay? And these are the sorts of roles that you will often have in project management architecture, borrowed in from the engineering specialties. Strategic steering group, always have one of those, and that's where you put your power barons. the executive group that actually make decisions and keep it on the pace, project manager and a change team that do a lot of the spade work, technical support team, particularly when you're changing jobs and you need HR, because you're going to be negotiating with trade unions, professional bodies, you're going to be redescribing jobs, people have legal rights. So we always have our HR specialists, and of course you need to basically, you're accountable, so we need to have some, if you like, a secretarial function, administrative function. So Tishi has given us a way of understanding how to understand complex change, and after the break we're going to dig in underneath with Ottaway and DiMaggio and Powell, and then look at Kurt Lewin and force field analysis. Okay?